Hi, Assalamualaikum everyone. Welcome back to Wellness Wednesday. Your girl, Ruann, per usual, basic introduction. So today is our last Wellness Wednesday for the month. Maybe will be continued, maybe not. We'll see, depending on what you guys think, how we'd like to carry it up, how we'd like to further proceed with this project or not. Our last speaker today is someone who I have personally worked with and I personally love and adore and has helped me a lot. Janelle Annette is an inner work coach for women who focuses on helping women heal subconscious patterns that are holding them back. She has been facilitating group and one-to-one sessions for over 3 years and has been training and facilitation for 4. She's passionate about helping people reconnect with their bodies in order to regulate their nervous system and create lasting change in their lives. Janelle currently offers mentorship for female entrepreneurs who want to get in touch with their authenticity in order to create a heart-centered business. She's currently living in Costa Rica, but she is a Canadian. Woo. She loves to travel, paint, dance, and spend time in nature. Please help me welcome our today's speaker, Janelle.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Hey.
Hello, Janelle. How are we doing today?
I'm doing so good. Thank you so much for asking. How are you doing?
Good. All is well. As I was saying, I personally worked with you, so I know your magic and how healing you are. You introduced me to the world of inner child work and shadow work. And so to kind of start off our discussion, what is shadow work?
Yeah, let's get started there because most people have no idea when I say that word, but it seems interesting. Right. So shadow work is looking at all the, you could say, disowned parts of our self or our being. So these are things that typically show up in like our subconscious patterning or aspects of ourself that we don't necessarily love or accept, or we would prefer not to see. So there's many different ways like that might, even just me saying that might present somebody to say, oh, I have this one insecurity and I could think of some things. So that's an element of it. But there's also a lot of it that we're not consciously aware of. So shadow work is the process of uncovering that self-rejection that we might be holding that's creating issues or blocks or disconnection in our lives.
And what would you say, how would you say the best ways to kind of identify our subconscious patterns?
Mm-hmm. There's a few different ways you can do that. And just in shadow work in itself is an element of that. One way to do it is also through our dreams. Our dreams are always revealing what's kind of going on in our subconscious and helping us to recognize that, because the subconscious mind is actually approximately 95% of our brain functioning. So we have about 5% of our conscious awareness. We think we're in charge, but really our subconscious mind is totally in charge of what's going on. So we have to look to patterns in our life. We have to look at what's repeating. So you might have a repeating relationship problem, right, or dynamic that you see repeats. Maybe you have similar conflicts in your life that, again, repeat. You find yourself like drawn to certain people. So we look for all this repetition to better understand what's going on in the subconscious mind. And we can also find clues for that in our dreams. So those are just a few ways to get started. If we're ever looking at our dreams, it's not like, it can be really difficult to analyze. So obviously dreams can be very abstract and weird and confusing, but to look toward the symbolism and the emotional undercurrent that is presented in each dream. So if you're feeling like stressed or people are chasing you, or maybe there's pressure, so we look for like the emotional cues, and then we look at what was the scenario in the dream, and we can start to understand the connection between our present day life and what we're experiencing and the subconscious and how that's creating it. Because ultimately our subconscious, kind of scary, but actually creates our life. And again, that's 95% of things that can be difficult to connect to and understand because it's part of our brain that we're not consciously in touch with.
Would you say, okay, so let's say going off of this dream example. So let's say, for example, I had a dream that I'm just like running, running, sweating, heart is beating fast. There's a dog outside barking. I don't understand. And, I wake up and I'm just like, the dream isn't as clear. It's very, a little vivid. Now I come to you and I'm just like, yo, I just had this dream. I don't know what's going on. How would you think, or how would you respond to something like that? I don't know if that's detailed enough.
Yeah. I mean, dream interpretation is going to be predominantly an exploration that you can make. Again, dream exploration is more just like a very light component of the work I do. But if we were exploring some patterns, let's say in your relationship or in your business, something that's coming up where you feel this constant maybe sense of pressure, or maybe there's just a lot of fear in your body. Maybe you often feel scared in your life generally, right? So I would try to make the connection to where in your life do you feel that way. If you could also connect to, like in this dream example of the dog chasing you, you could connect to my body and say, okay, so in that dream, my body felt anxious. Like maybe I felt a lot of heat and my heart was beating fast. And then you might try to pull, okay, well, where is that sensation and that emotion presenting itself in my present day reality? And from there, could we try to understand what it's linked to underneath? So, for example, maybe you just feel generally really stressed around, let's say, work or what's going on in your business, and you feel that activation, you feel the heat and the beating heart and, that similar sensation to the dog chasing you. And maybe through further, and again, this is just me completely giving a random example, not to like prescribe this meaning to a dog chasing you dream. But, perhaps if we look deeper, maybe you would tie a lot of your worth or the value you see in yourself to your work. And so maybe there's all the stress around work. If it feels like it's not going well, then, oh no, what is that going to mean about me? Right. And that would be, we're going in a lot of directions, but that would be linking to the family system. So then we'd want to see, okay, well, where did we learn in our early childhood development that maybe it was really, really important to succeed, or maybe to always be perfect, or right, whatever association we might be able to gather to understand, why does this feel so unsafe or intense on my nervous system when in all actuality we're safe? Because so many of us are technically safe, right? Nothing's actually threatening, our safety a lot of the time, but we feel like it is because we're working with these primitive nervous systems that are wired for survival. So we just want to be able to put together all the pieces and try to understand the symbolism through, again, all these different examples that somebody might experience in their life.
So that kind of leads to this book that you were talking about and you recommended for me and like your followers on Instagram. And It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wong. Mm-hmm. And that kind of touches on inner child work and how the effects of epigenetics plays a major role in kind of like our development. And so can you talk a little bit on that and how kind of like how does early childhood development have to do with our current daily patterns and issues?
Yeah. Wow, it's all the ways. It's it's quite fascinating when we get down to it. It's like, oh, pretty much everything can be chalked up to something that happened in our early childhood. And the confusing thing for people, first I'll say, it's not necessary to understand every single association of like, this is from this, and otherwise you're just going to kind of drive yourself a little bit crazy. But it is important to have the context as to, a lot of the things you might be struggling with, whether that's in your relationship, in your own like mental health and well-being, or in, your ability to maybe put yourself out there, or in your job, whatever. There's often there is always a deeper reason to why that is. It's not because there's something fatally wrong with you, right? Was where we often go. There's actually some kind of reason, some kind of response that you're just working with from some stage of your development. So, in Mark Wolwin's work, which was really great. I did a facilitator training with him. He goes into epigenetics. And so for any of you that don't know what that is, it's the study of how our genes are essentially adapting through the like behavioral traits of people. So it's like how like trauma and things might get passed on in our genes, not just behaviorally. Hopefully that makes sense. So obviously if we have something quite traumatizing happening in our home, or our parents dealt with something traumatizing, that's going to impact them behaviorally, which will impact us. And then again, epigenetics is also saying that the study of looking into how our genes actually change as a result. So the most simple way to explain this is that, let's say, for example, one of your ancestors was present or involved in a war of some kind, right? Can be very traumatizing. And, you know, they might have something like PTSD where a loud bomb goes off and they get, you know, scared because they learned how to respond in that environment. So if we think about, you know, how we adapt for survival, right? It's the idea that you as a like coming from that lineage, coming from that person, might actually adapt the same stress response in order to keep yourself safe, even though you're not actually presently in that dangerous scenario. So that's the idea, and that's more of like on an ancestral level, right, of how things get passed down. And of course, there's the behavioral things. If the parents maybe went through some really deep trauma, they might have a difficult time, let's say, for example, connecting with their emotions, which might, you know, impact their ability to attune to you as a child, right? To show you, I see you, I'm involved with you in your emotional experience. Because as children, we can't, especially when we're, you know, before we speak, we can't actually verbally communicate our needs. So how do we communicate? Through our emotions. So for example, if we have a parent that's, you know, connected to most of their emotions, but not to sadness, for example, when we're really sad or having this response, if we feel like our parents aren't actually engaged with our sadness or aren't showing that sense of empathy, right, through their facial expression, right? Because we're as babies, we're looking to see, are you understanding this emotion? So even though they might be doing the right things and taking care of you, you as a baby can sense that they're not connecting or attuning to that emotion with you. So even just in something as simple as that, which most of us have been through, right? These are relatively normal things. Even though you won't remember that, again, I like to think of like trauma or anything like in this work. We all have work to do in this area. We all can strengthen our connection with ourselves and our emotions and understand that makeup that is unique to each of us. So with this emotion example, you might then find as an adult, you have a hard time connecting to your own sadness. And maybe that's because when you were growing up, that wasn't really being attuned to you, or maybe that wasn't really encouraged of you. Maybe you were told, like, don't cry, don't go into that, you're okay. And that's not to blame any parent that couldn't hold space for that. You know, they're just doing the best with what they could do. But it's also recognizing how that would impact you today. So again, that's just a few examples. Yeah, do you want to jump in and ask any questions from that point? I know I covered a lot there.
Yeah, those are a lot of really amazing points. It was on, I think the main question that really stood out to me is like, well, two things that honestly stood out to me is emotions, right? You talked about really feeling our emotions and accepting our emotions and acknowledging them, and I guess being grounded is, you know, what I always learned from you. And so I guess that's point one. And then point two, or this may tie together, I'm not sure, vulnerability, right? So a lot of people take vulnerability as a weakness. And a lot of times the term vulnerability, like the first thing you think of is like emotion, right? And so when we speak about emotions, do we tie that in under allowing oneself to be vulnerable with our emotions? or are we allowing oneself to feel our emotions so that we can be vulnerable with our emotions?
Yeah, both. If somebody struggles with vulnerability, I want to say vulnerability is actually this like large scope, and I think a lot of people associate it with just like grieving or feeling sad, which is part of it, and that is hard for a lot of people to be seen in their sadness. So yes, and vulnerability is really just the practice of putting all of who you are out there for the world to see. It's really deeply connected to being authentic, right? Authentic in our truth, in our emotions, in our thoughts. So the reason that's so important, and the issue in thinking that it's a weakness, is that's actually how our connection is built. We're more connected to people when we can see all of who they are. That's including maybe the challenging emotions and the true thoughts, right? If somebody's very muted and like holds back a lot, it can be hard to connect with that person. So vulnerability is the heart of connection. And it's also the heart of healing. If we, let's say, have some kind of sadness and we feel like, I can't share this with anyone because why? We only ever feel that way because we think in some capacity it'll make us weak, we're not lovable, we're not worthy in some way. So we keep it hidden. And then what happens is if we overcome that and we work to be vulnerable, we let ourselves be seen in that emotion, then again, in the right container, we want to think about sharing with people that we know will be supportive. If somebody comes back to us and it goes, you're not alone in that, I also feel this way, then A, we're more connected to that person, and B, we suddenly feel better about ourselves because we realize, oh, I can share more of who I am, and that's still being loved and I'm still being accepted. I'm not going to reject that part of myself so much. So it helps us accept ourselves more, and it helps us deepen in connection when we know how to truly be vulnerable with others.
And those are really good points. I think too, what makes a person so afraid of being vulnerable is that backlash they'll receive, right? And so kind of what would you say, you mentioned something too, like being vulnerable around those who, I think if I heard right, but correct me if I'm wrong, who we feel like, I'm so huge on vibes personally. So if we feel like this, we're vibing with this person, do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, or is vulnerability something that we should 24/7 be doing?
So let's say we're speaking more to like a deep personal share about your life or your history or something that feels really be challenging for you to share. I actually personally wouldn't say just like run around the streets with a megaphone and be like, here's my deepest, darkest secret. Maybe if you want to be like a really extreme shadow worker person that wants to, work through these ego fears, then sure. However, I think there's also a lot of strength in saying, I'm going to keep these, for me. And when I feel as though I want to deepen with somebody, when I feel that safety in this container of some kind of relationship, could be friendship, romantic, whatever, I want to deepen with that person, I'm going to bring this side of me forward. Because, so let's bring in the example of romantic relationships. Let's say you have something from your past that maybe was quite traumatic, or even just a bit traumatic, and you have a hard time letting people in, for example, because of what happened. It could be really potent for you to explain if you want to move further and deepen in your connection with somebody, to say, hey, sometimes I have a hard time opening up and I can put up walls, and it's not because of you or what you're doing. It's actually from this event. And then that gives them context as to why, and they don't take it on so personally. So again, I'm using that example of vulnerability and truth telling and truth sharing in an intentional way. So yeah, when it comes to really deep, intense shares, I would say, hold that to your heart. You don't need to share that with everybody. Not everyone needs to see all those aspects, but in relationships that you want to deepen, I always encourage bringing those parts forward, especially if they feel scary to share, because there's often some, medicine, if you will, in overcoming that growth edge and letting yourself be seen. You don't want to necessarily just give that to the entire world, right? We want to give it to relationships that we know will be able to like hold that and, ideally hold us in a loving light. We can't expect that of all relationships. Maybe somebody reacts poorly and that would be unfortunate, but, we can do the best that we can with being intentional about sharing our heart's full truth and so on.
Right. I think a majority of the audience too that's watching, so they are of the Muslim faith, right? So a lot of these viewers have come from our first generation, kids in the Americas. Their family has fled poverty or they fled a war. They just, came here for the American dream or the better lifestyle or whatever we'd like to call it these days. And there has been this internal crisis that, this generation has dealt with, and that's the dual personality or the dual cultures that we have to take in, or we have to do this to make this person happy, but we want to do this because this makes us happy. And so they're balancing like this American identity versus their cultural identity, and it has thus resulted in a cultural confusion. And so what are some ways you would recommend or some advice you could give someone who's struggling to self-identify? Would the first and proper steps be, this inner child shadow work? Would it be figuring out, what they like, who they are, how do they, I guess like the mind is so confused with like who they are and what their identity is and how to self-identify in a comfortable way in the atmosphere that they are in and the environment that they are interacting with. So how can one be themselves while also not letting go of their, cultural background or their ethnicity, or, finding a balance between the two?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's actually really, really important for people to be, connected to their culture and, to their ancestry and to things that have been carried with them through generations. I think for a lot of people in North America, that's been a bit lost, unfortunately. So, that's just more of a side note. But when it comes to identifying like who you are, because that can be a confusing question, right? If you say, do you feel connected to your authentic nature? A lot of people will say like, I don't actually know who that is. And so I'll answer this in a few different scopes. If you are a person that feels like, I don't even really know who I am and what my authentic nature is being, that's often a result of, maybe trying to be someone that you're not in order to like appease someone, right? This could be just by like, let's say being a people pleaser, right? And that fear of upsetting people and wanting to say the right things. This could be a result of, again, like something like you just explained, like living in a country where there's cultural differences and that maybe isn't fully supported. Like there can be all these ways that we essentially, I don't want to say like don't follow our authentic truth in order to fit in. And the main idea with that is none of that's like bad or shameful. We're just trying to do our best to be accepted and be loved, and that's normal and natural and okay. So to those people, I would say your authentic nature is not gone. That doesn't leave you, right? It might just be masked under some layers of like fear and trying to also stay safe. And like when I say stay safe, I mean more so like the behavioral adaptations that you might have that you've developed through your life, right? So for example, if somebody was bullied a lot, they're going to have certain behavioral adaptations that they might use to stay safe. Maybe that's being a people pleaser, or maybe that's not speaking up, maybe, which would cause them to not feel so connected to their authentic nature. So your authentic nature never leaves, right? It's always there within you. However, it can change and adapt as we grow and mature and our values change. So really, to answer your question, the biggest thing would be getting in touch with like, okay, so today in this moment, how am I feeling and what do I need? Some pretty simple questions that we don't often ask ourselves, right? We don't often check in with what our needs are, because once we start understanding how we're feeling that day and what we need, we begin to be more resourced in planning our day and our lives around meeting our own needs, which in turn is honoring our authentic expression, right? So when I say that, that also brings forward the conversation of like, well, what if I don't know how I feel because I haven't done that? So a practice is something called somatic scanning. You close your eyes and you're essentially in a meditation, and you're bringing your awareness from the top of your head and scanning all the way down through your entire body, picking up for sensations, right? So for a clear example, if somebody's feeling very anxious, a lot of us know how this might feel in the body, like typically heat and typically fast beating heart in the chest, sadness, that could be that lump in that throat. And we often only feel these sensations when we're in the extreme of our emotional reactions. But if we actually practice, on a daily basis, tuning in to the more subtle sensations, we become more aware of like how you're feeling. So I know that seems different, like authentic nature and emotion, but it's not really, because the more clear you are on like how you're feeling that day, the more you can express from that place and have needs met from that place. So instead of just maybe like going forward with your normal day and doing things for other people or for work or just being busy, you can actually check in with like, no, I think I actually need to carve out some time for, whatever today in order to meet that need. So that's a simple practice on getting more attuned to like, how am I feeling today? What do I need? And then from there, we begin to see our values more as a person. What do we value? What do we want more of in life? How do we want to discern in our relationships? So the more clear we are in our needs, the more clear we are on our values, and that is part of our authentic nature. And then from there, again, like I said, you can discern between maybe like certain activities don't serve you, or certain, groups of people or friends or partners or whatever, maybe don't align so much. So you can just become more conscious as to how you want to be in your life and the choices you want to make based on values and needs and feelings.
That's very well said. So, all right. So we identify our emotions. Okay. We know what it is that upsets us. We have done our groundwork. We have recognized our authenticity. Now we have trigger points.
Yeah.
So how can we begin to catch our kind of like, these reactionary states before they take over?
Yeah, great question. So we all have reactions, and this gets to be the fun part. So if we're sitting here in this moment, hopefully we're all feeling relaxed, hopefully. You're in a relatively calm state, and you might be able to say, oh, yeah, I know in this moment of my life, something happened and I got really reactive and I spiked up. So retrospectively, we can look at that and say, okay, when maybe things like this happen, I tend to have a reaction. So before you're actually in the reactionary state, I would say it's really helpful to map out things that typically trigger you or activate you right in your nervous system. It's one aspect. So we can be more prepared, essentially being like, oh, I think it's going to come. Second is that practice I just talked about, the somatic scanning, because reactionary states, where we might like, essentially a trigger is like let me just explain a trigger. A trigger is like a reaction that is not proportionate to what is going on in the scenario. So maybe somebody said something and you, in your interpretation, felt it meant something a lot different, and you got really, really angry, right? Or something. And maybe you said mean things. Because to you in that moment, that comment did mean something intense, because you're often pulling from some past experience where there's pain, where there's unresolved emotional pain. So then you go, okay, you said this comment and it means this. We make meaning out of it and we get reactive. So we need to understand that our triggers, or if we get really reactive in a moment, isn't because we're some bad person or we're rude or we're inconsiderate. It's that is actually just maybe that comment. Because sometimes when we get really reactive, we're like, ooh, that was that wasn't cool how I handled that. So shame is not helpful when we're in that moment. So if that's ever happened to you, I hope you can just like get rid of the shame in this moment and recognize that there was just some kind of activation or unresolved thing from some point in your life where you're still carrying some pain and some hurt. So you did your best in that reactionary state to try to feel safe or try to deal with that. And maybe that's why it's a pattern. Maybe you react in that same way over and over again because part of your mind, part of the subconscious mind doesn't understand if this thing that's happening in the present moment, or it doesn't see that the thing that's happening in the present moment is separate from perhaps some kind of past like trauma or unresolved situation. Hopefully that makes sense. So you're reacting disproportionately because you're reacting to something that happened maybe back in the day that's been unresolved. So to recap, how do we become less reactive is to map out when we have these reactions and then to try to connect the dots of like, okay, what does it look like? Could I think of to a time in my life that this feels similar to? Now, and then the other third point is to begin to be more conscious of the reactions and how they feel in our body. And then a big practice would be to regulate your nervous system beforehand, right? So if you know you're going to go into a conversation where you might have some reaction or, might be really hard, things like deep breathing practices, even if it's just 3 deep belly breaths, that helps to start resetting our nervous system. So as simple as breathing deeply, focusing on using the belly, grounding into the present moment. So again, if part of you is reacting to some moment that, again, we have this association to the past. It sounds silly, but grounding in and like looking at objects in the room and be like, okay, that's a mirror, that's a hat, that's a, whatever, a window. Seems silly, but it helps us orientate with our mind, being like, okay, I'm in this moment. I'm not back then. So that can help ground us into the present moment. The breathing will help regulate our reactionary state. The context will help us understand why so that we can work through it. And if there's any kind of like emotional response that you need to go feel, that maybe that's associated with it, maybe when you think back to this memory and you go, oh, that feels really similar, that reaction feels like it's coming from this moment in my past, maybe to explore where that unresolved pain or trauma might be coming from so that you could do some emotional processing around that, trauma that maybe you haven't dealt with. And the more we can process and move through that trauma or unresolved pain, the less reactive we become in the present moment. Big question, but important work.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? But so we figure out, I'm just going to follow up with these questions because I'm telling you.
Yeah.
So we figure out, that this trigger point is, the root cause of it is, like you mentioned, something from the past has caused us to, that's triggered us. How do we begin that process towards that, towards the healing, towards figuring out how to address it, how to overcome it?
Well, again, I would say map it out. Like I would stick to those similar points, like just explore retrospectively when you're not in a really triggered state, because it's really hard to try to remember and do these things when you're in that moment of reactivity. So I would say pay attention, or look back and think of a few moments in your life where you got very reactive, defensive, angry, upset, maybe some kind of conflict. And I would try to look for similar themes in that, try to understand the pattern. Maybe it's when somebody said a certain kind of thing, or there's some kind of reoccurring dynamic toward it or within it. And then I would try to make that connection to your past, try to understand what that is. Just get really vulnerable about that and try to see if maybe there's some unresolved emotional experience in there that you could work through. And again, breathing practices. We could all use more breathing practices always. One thing that's really simple, and one of my teachers talks about, is just taking one conscious breath before we say anything to anybody. Just the practice of taking one conscious breath, because it helps us get more into the regulated nervous system, into the present moment, and be a little more intentional with the words we're speaking rather than just feeding into these repetitive loops that we're kind of unaware of. Because the subconscious mind, when we're just operating in that, it feels like we're on autopilot. So you'll just be saying things, doing things in this very autopilot-like state. So the more conscious awareness we can bring before we have any kind of conversation is helpful. So conscious breaths before we speak is helpful as well.
Perfect. So, okay, all that makes sense. All right, so we figured out the trigger point. We've done all the conscious practice, but yet we are still being triggered. What is it? Now, a lot of times people use this defense argument, which is you are being triggered because of your own internal conflicts or your lack of confidence or whatever it is. When in reality, the person actually may have been saying some hurtful things to hurt that person's feelings. So how does one identify a trigger point versus someone just being mean?
Well, again, we're looking at triggers as disproportionate reactions. So, I mean, if somebody's blatantly just being rude, and it's subjective, I guess you have to explore that for yourself. But if somebody's just blatantly being rude, then, a frustrated response is probably appropriate, because we need to set a boundary and maybe say, hey, I'm not okay with you speaking to me like that. Please don't talk to me in that way, right? So that's an appropriate way to handle that. But if somebody says something kind of like, let's say maybe a little bit passive aggressive, and we start like going off on them and yelling and like calling them names, we might be reacting a little bit disproportionately. So on one hand, yes, maybe that person said something passive aggressive and that wasn't cool. And if we're in this explosive mode, then there's probably more for us to look at. So yeah, like you're saying, just because we're being accountable for our own emotional experience and our own reactions doesn't mean that we don't need boundaries. We still need to tell people when it's not okay to speak to us in a certain way. But again, we're looking for like disproportionate reactions, the moments of like heightened trigger. And it's usually when you look back and go, whoa, that was really intense. I don't know where that came from, right? That's more of that feeling. But yes, of course, if somebody's just being rude, then we should speak to that. And it's okay to be frustrated or angry or hurt by rude comments.
Awesome. So we briefly touched on inner child work, and we kind of talked about shadow work, but I feel like we haven't really, I think, dived into it as much. All of the things that we have been talking about, I mean, obviously the trigger points, they have something to do with, like you said, something in the past that could tie in with inner child work. But what is exactly shadow work? And I remember it as you kind of like explained this. It's something that we like to push to the shadow, something about ourselves that we like to kind of like push to the side that we don't like to bring up. And so that could be, like we briefly spoke about, a part of like our identity or a part of who we are, whatever it may be. And so I guess the question is, how can we befriend our shadow? Or how can we learn to let go of that part of the shadow? So reuniting with our shadow could be a blessing, and cutting it completely off could be also a blessing, right? So there are parts of us that we don't like, that we want to get rid of forever. But there are parts of us that we don't like that are actually a blessing for us that we should identify, right? And so I don't know which one you want to answer first.
Well, I guess the idea is not, like, shadow work is not to say we identify these parts of ourselves that we want to get rid of entirely and because they're terrible. Because that's just affirming that you're like something about you is not okay. So the idea with shadow work is it's about understanding your self-rejection so that you can move into more self-acceptance. Because let's say you have an aspect of your personality that you want to work on or change. That's okay. It's okay to want to change and grow, but we have to understand why we have that component of ourselves, right? Like, let's say, for example, it's that we have a lot of social anxiety, for example, okay? And we feel really uncomfortable talking to people or in groups of people. So if that was something somebody was struggling with, it's not to say I want to eradicate that anxious person because it's bad and I want to be better at being social. First, we need to understand, well, where is that anxiety linked to and why is that present and where did it originate? We have to recognize the innocence in it. Or, you know, with a different example, maybe you say mean things about people and you can be really harsh, or maybe you gossiped a lot in your life and maybe you feel guilt around that. Instead of shaming yourself into it, it's to go, okay, what's really going on here? Why am I acting in this way? Because there's always some kind of justified reason for those maybe aspects of yourself that you don't like or you don't want to have, right? So we just have to have the context and the understanding, because the more we reject those parts of ourselves and say, get away, I don't want to do with you, they actually end up, it has a way of like overtaking in our lives. So we have to be able to accept, to integrate, and then we often see that that's when those things actually kind of change, right? So just to like paint a picture, one way you can do shadow work very simply is to look at your judgments of other people, right? So if you have a judgment towards somebody, let's say they're really loud and expressive, for example, and you don't like them because they're really loud and maybe you find them annoying, you have to then try to look at yourself in that reflection. So it's not always black and white. It doesn't necessarily mean, oh, you're also loud and you don't love that part of yourself, so you judge them. That could be the case. Maybe you're also really loud and you like to talk a lot and share, and you feel a bit insecure about that part of you. Maybe you think it's a little bit too much or overwhelming. So you're going to see that in someone else and go, oh, that's bad. And I also think I'm kind of bad for that. Or on the other hand, maybe you were really expressive at one point in your life, and then maybe somebody told you that it's bad, that you should be quiet, that you're being too much, settle down. So you now learned as an adult to keep that very repressed. So you might, as a person, the way you might show up is being very quiet and reserved, and you might judge loud people who talk a lot because that part of you has been rejected so much that you keep it hidden, you keep it away. But it's still an aspect of you, right? So this is an example of how a judgment might show you more about yourself. Look for the repetitive judgments, right? You're going to repetitively judge people for similar things, and that's where you really want to look at, how do I see myself in comparison to this person? So yeah, I went to a few different sides to hopefully explain the shadow, but yeah.
Yeah, that was broken down really good. I'm just thinking of like how you mentioned, like understanding our judgment of others as a reflection of ourselves, which generally we really shouldn't be judging, right? Because we never know what the other is going through. But it's really, really hard. Like, I think what we've noticed is it's really hard for people to call themselves out on their BS. So what are some ways that someone can really like check their self? Like, let's say, for example, you have this really toxic friend, okay? Or you have this really interesting person in your life and they just don't recognize their like parents, for example. I'll use like a lot of viewers, old generational parents, like old generation, like to be very judgmental of the new generation or whatever it is that it may be. How can the viewers, help? Well, you're gonna hate me for saying this, but how can they help their family to open their eyes, or to be less judgmental, or to recognize that part of themselves? And I feel like you're going to yell at me for even asking that. It's like,
Yell at you.
It's not our responsibility.
What do you say? I'm going to like hate you and yell at you. Have you met me? I'm like the most like peaceful person. Yes. So what you just said, it is not our responsibility to make people own their BS. And that can be frustrating because we want people, especially people that we love and we're in relationship with, to take ownership of themselves. But we can't do that for them. The only thing we can do is focus on owning our own BS and sharing that and leading with example, because people are actually getting more reciprocal to that. So if you're like, hey, you do this thing and it sucks and you're not taking ownership of it and you should see this about yourself because you're not seeing it, they're going to be like, screw you. Like, they're not going to be like down for you. And you're like, hey, you look at you and you're doing all this stuff that I don't like. If you're going, whew, I noticed that last week when we had that conversation, I said this and maybe it was kind of passive aggressive and I recognized that wasn't cool. I was just feeling a little bit upset because of things going on in my personal life. So anyway, I just wanted to let you know that if I seemed like reactive or rude, it was just because I was having a really hard day and I think I just needed some like alone time and I didn't give that to myself. So just wanted to clear that. And they go, oh, okay, I'll stop taking that personally. And then they also go, oh, that's a way that we can communicate. Oh, we can do that. So you lead by example and you actually invite people in to check themselves more often. Some people will, some people won't. That's a, you know, the unfortunate thing. And sometimes with like, you know, family situations, we don't always have that luxury of saying, oh, this person just won't check themselves, so I'm going to not be connected with them. Because obviously with family, it's different. So sometimes it's just a journey of loving and accepting people with all their issues, with all their unaccounted for BS, and going, I see you as a human struggling and doing your best. Maybe you're projecting and being rude. Maybe I need boundaries so that emotionally I can handle this relationship, right? Maybe I need more space alone, or maybe I need to exit when conversations are escalating. So you can set yourself up for that success. And then again, simultaneously, it's a really hard practice, but just work on loving people unconditionally with all of their stuff, their baggage and their damage and everything, just as, you know, we're trying to do for ourselves, because we all carry parts of ourselves that are hard to look at or hard to be with. But it's about not making us or anybody wrong for it. That's the biggest part. You're not wrong for it. You're just doing your best with, you know, some kind of survival technique. And when I say survival, I'm talking about like, obviously not when we're talking about like your safety and well-being, but it's just the way you've adapted based on behavioral things in your environment. So yeah, that's what I would say about that, about other people and their BS.
Awesome. So one more question before the serious question is, you spoke a lot about boundaries, and how do you set boundaries? How do you decide on your boundaries? What if a person is, especially like I'm talking about a lot throughout this, it's like this generational gap of like, what do you mean you have boundaries? Like, no, we don't do this, you know, culturally, or no, like we're family. Like there's no such thing as boundaries. Like how does one set those and stand their ground in setting those?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Something to note is if we have not been setting boundaries our entire life, let's say we kind of have some, you know, people-pleasing tendencies, or in our family system, there wasn't space for boundaries and there was a lot imposed on us, it's going to be quite activating and uncomfortable for people once we start setting boundaries. People might not react very well to them at first, and that's because it might be a bit scary for them, right? And other people, they might be interpreting it as, can you hear me okay, by the way, Ruan? Your thing is freezing a little, and I just want to make sure my voice is coming through clear.
It's a little scratchy. Your mic's a little scratchy.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, but your mic is just still a little scratchy.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yours is very, very broken, so I'm wondering if it's me or if it's you.
We'll just keep going and
I'm good. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay. So, right, it's going to be uncomfortable for people once we start presenting these boundaries, of course. So we have to expect that and be okay with maybe people being like, no, we don't have boundaries. Like, that's not what we do in this family. So we have to be understanding if somebody's feeling fearful that we're putting boundaries up, right? And maybe saying, I need more alone time, or I don't want to talk about this anymore. They might go, oh no, do they not love me? Or are they going to leave or whatever? So we have to expect for some reactions and communicate our boundaries from a heart-centered place. Okay. So instead of just going, you're way too much, this conversation tires me and I don't want to talk to you anymore. Because people will be like angry or sad from that. We can go, hey, I'm noticing that in these moments that we're having, I'm going to say for some, let's say there's some kind of conversation that tends to escalate and there's fights that break out or something, you don't want to deal with it anymore. You might say something like, hey, I noticed that when this topic gets brought up, there's a lot of conflict. And I recognize for me that it's a sensitive topic because, I feel, I don't know, insecure around that topic or something, right? So taking ownership. So I tend to get really reactionary, and I see that you're also getting reactionary. And so I think what would just be best for us in our relationship is if we take some time just apart so that we don't get explosive and we can just like relax and get to a calm state before we return to this conversation, right? So we just communicate in a way of like, here's why, this is why I'm doing it, here's my ownership piece, and of course that's in one example where we're talking like a conversation. If you just want more space from somebody, it might look a little bit different, but you just explain your why underneath that. Why is that important to you, right? What's that going to give you, right? Or let's say we have a friend that keeps calling us up and just wants to tell us about all their problems, and it can be kind of draining, right? For example, it's what a lot of people deal with, and you can say, hey, like, I just want to let you know, I have a lot going on in my life. I love listening to, what's going on in your world. I care for you. I just have a certain capacity of how much I can like listen and hear when there's a lot going on. So for me, I'd love to just maybe open our conversations with a check-in of like, hey, do you have space to hold for me? Like, right? Do you have an ear to listen? Or do you have that capacity? And giving me an opportunity to say yes or no. Right? So something like that. Again, just explaining the why and the heart-centeredness behind it, and leading with love and compassion, of course, so that people can be more receptive.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Janelle. So I guess with a couple minutes left, what are some practices that we could get started on today to work towards, setting these boundaries, doing our inner child shadow work, so forth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say getting started with those somatic scans, and hopefully my internet's okay and you can hear me, so just let me know if I need to repeat anything. Doing those somatic scans on a daily basis, I would really suggest breathing practices, especially in the morning, right? So checking in, how do I feel right when I wake up? Is it like activated and stressed? Can I take a moment just to do, deep breathing exercises, maybe a meditation? Those are some more like body-based tools. And then some ideas you could play with is looking at maybe some kind of reoccurring struggle you have in your life. Maybe that's a relationship pattern you notice repeating. Maybe that's a conflict that seems to keep coming up. Maybe that's a reaction you're having. And I would just start writing out all the things that you can think, the reoccurring patterns and when it happens. And I would just start exploring, what are the common themes here? And how can I connect this to maybe somewhere in my childhood? And then from there, if I recognize like, oh, this feels like this time when I was a child, and then you could ask yourself, okay, well, in that moment when I was a child, what do I think I really needed in that moment? What did I think I needed that maybe I didn't get? And maybe that might be some physical touch or a hug and be like, hey, you're safe. You're going to be okay. Or like, I'm here for you, right? Maybe you needed more quality time with somebody. So identify those needs that you would have had when you were young. If you find that association, so we have the painful pattern that's happening in your current day, we relate it to the past. And then we ask, what's the need? What was the need when I was experiencing that? And then as an adult, how can I to myself today? So that's a process of reparenting our inner child, right? So connecting to that moment in our childhood and meeting those needs with where we're at.
Perfect. And so we did have one question, and if there were like
a
list of books or a couple of like 3 to 5 books, what books would you recommend to for a person to read to really start learning more and bettering oneself on this topic? Did I lose you?
Apologies, it's coming in really staticky.
Sorry. Can you hear me good now, or?
I can try changing my internet over. There we go. Okay. When did you lose me? I'm back.
Okay, awesome. So I said there was one question that did come in, and what books would you recommend for the viewers to read? About 3 to 5 books.
3 to 5 books. Wow. Okay. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van Kolk or something like that. It's all about the somatic work and how trauma and emotions are stored in our body. This one's a little bit more intense, but I personally love it. It's brought me to tears. And that is Belonging by Toko Pa Turner. That's a little bit more like shadow work, kind of Carl Jung like things. Would be a bit more intense. It's dense but really beautiful. It Didn't Start With You by Mark Woolwin is really great. He's a fantastic teacher, and I feel very honored to have been able to work with him. And if you're in a relationship and you want to work through some things, a really great book is Getting the Love That You Want by, I'm forgetting, not Diane. Getting the Love You Want, I think Harville Hendricks, Getting the Love You Want. And then the last one I could say is also The Power of Attachment by Dr. Diane Pooler, something like that. She has a great attachment book that I recommend.
Awesome. I actually wrote all those down for myself as well, so I'm excited to get on that. I still have my my access to the little portal that you left us. Yes. So guys, again, this is the wonderful Janelle. Please follow her on Instagram. Her @ is right beside her name. She always posts amazing things for inner child shadow work. She does also provide programs, one-to-one sessions where specifically catered to women, where you get an opportunity to work on this topic with her and really dive in and to do some healing. She is launching something new, and really it's towards entrepreneurship, correct, for women in, so to help. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's to help women, that have personal brands be more authentic in their expression, more connected to their message, doing heartfelt marketing. Oops, apologies, that's an alarm. Heartfelt marketing, just being able to really bring some kind of soul-led mission forward, and also work over the fears of like being seen and showing up, because obviously personal branding has a lot of putting yourself out there that can be very confronting. So I'm looking to support, coaches and healers and people that have big missions to help and support people and to serve people, feel more confident, step more into leadership, for women specifically, to know how to work with their bodies and their unique makeup in a way that feels good for them. So it's just about like aligned business strategy. That's for right now. I will continually expand and have different components. You can definitely follow along with my work, and I'll have more courses and things like that available as time goes on. And I'm always here to chat and just answer questions that anybody may have, as I'm very passionate about this work and I just want to share it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jill. We really appreciated having you with us on our last event for this project. Maybe extending, but I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us and to speak about inner child shadow work. It's really good seeing you again.
Of course. So good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Yes, ma'am. Take care, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right. And as you guys have it, that is a wrap for our Wellness Wednesdays. We may be continuing this, we may not. Let us know. Feel free to reach out to me at relbassy@pausa.org or the IAR Health and Wellness team to talk any concerns or questions or whatever you have in mind. Inshallah, Ramadan Mubarak to you all. And Eid Mubarak is right around the corner. And we really hope you guys enjoyed this amazing session that we offered you guys this year. All right. Best of luck. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.